Shini more, Tiring Tibini more, Nihelana Jeta Ashiti, Kasutila Jashi Taki, Nihelana Jeta Ashiti, Kasutila Jashi Taki, Sikyong Penpa Tsering Shini more, Tiring Tibini more, Nihelana Toso Chimerti, Rudi Marchuri.
Come some sugar, Peggy Lana Nebuti, General Consa Gambushambo Chola, Gosum, Kucha, Pure Tone, Upimidixuki, Pandesikan Pematin Chota, Aditanger, Namgit Chola, Kumotensigungine. Minnesota 지진 속배 귤레 다 미네소타 신게 상마 찹슈네 잠이다시다 슈예. And so on behalf of the Tibetan American Foundation of Minnesota as well as the young people of Minnesota, we would like to extend our warm welcome back to Minnesota to Sikyong Penpa Tsering as well as Dr. Namgyal Churupla, the representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the Office of Tibet in DC.
Terin chuzu ni samki nixel zerin pe shenge la ligne lerim goti shubayin. Tang sena shenge ta zenje peki tiksu parki delam pe sang to gyuni shindu kechembuyin. Terin kungu chone Global Significance of Tibetan Plateau, Zamblinki, Tokang Pöte, Gelchi Tedar, Kel Chembo Yimba, Gorki, Galop Nanguyen. Manso Loptu, Shenge Sota, Game, Geti, Nelu, Shepa, Chegu, Pe. Kel Chemboyen, Galop, Jupsel, Jupsam, Shenge, Tiwa Chile, Shuguni, Te Je, Shenge Namgi, Tento, Kubar Jutu, Je, Teringi Zerimi.
So to repeat what Ajahn Lama said, the main purpose of our event today with the youth and Sikyong is twofold. So the first is to basically strengthen the connection between us or the Minnesota young people with the Central Tibetan Administration. And so, because basically I feel like a lot of us have grown up hearing about CTA and Sikyong, right? But we don't really know much beyond that except for the titles. So we hope that today will give you a deeper insight and maybe inspire you to learn more. And so the second part is we're going to receive updates about the current situation in Tibet as well as the current environment in Tibet, and then also maybe what we can do to help the situation. And so for today's program, it's pretty basic. We're going to start off with a talk from Sikyong for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then following with a question and answer session. So make sure you guys have that ready, and then close with a group photo. But before we begin, let me provide a brief background about Sikyong. So, how many of you here have heard of Belogopi before? Raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, nice. So, Sikyong Penpa Tsering was born in Belogopi and went on to graduate with a degree in economics from Madras Christian College. And it's in college where he actually joined the Tibetan freedom movement, like many of you guys here. In 1996, he was elected into Tibet's parliament in exile, and then from 2008 to 2016, he served as the Speaker of Parliament. Following that, Sikyong served as the representative of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan government in exile in North America, which is where he engaged with Congress and top administration offices to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict. And then lastly, as we know now, Sikyong Penpa Tsering has held the office of Sikyong since May of 2021. So without further ado, I will let Sikyong Penpa Tsering take the mic. Thank you.
이지게나는 람나스치네 송도 아니야 캬송원에 그게 있잖아 송도와 생에 이거 제대치네 제작과 I speak both in Tibetan as well as English together, so you can also understand what it means in Tibetan and what it means in English, right? Okay, 다 당구디 그랬으면 가와사자 가와치메이네 외바고 아주 쉬게 주의기 혹시 가족들도 지금 잠잠 주저만 빼놨다 인간데 잡아래 그래서 라시아 오시오, but I couldn't meet with all of you because we came around 3 o'clock in the afternoon and then we had the public gathering in the evening and the next morning I had to leave to some other place. 이제 주저마당을 주저마당에 정말 찬도 수등아도 제고 중요하래 엔타니 그 소백문에 인지미지 양가의 영어로 시시니까 나오나 신신의 말이자 안티도 대식 대화를 통한 우리 향수 수도 직제 돌아서네 고급 총알이 빼면서 가오충 향수 테스트레 향수 대표가 투시나 신디 쉬어 또 총송 가장 향수 대표 방지 전다 활동이었으나 소속 대화 집에 차네 아니 교육 내용 거래야 망사하고에 대화요. That shows your interest to understand more about your country or people and the responsibilities that you will have to take in the future. So the first generations of Tibetans who came into exile were in 1959, around that some 80,000 Tibetans followed or preceded His Holiness exile into India. So, did you do? 미럽 당구디게 되네 수패버데 되네 수패디 선발라 아주 괜찮아서 부쇼다 아니던데 이나 우리가 막 공부나 대요나 일로 좀 됐어요. 심바 ordinary Tibetans 왜 휴먼 나올라 아니 좀 싫어요 말에 변화를 대상 좀 modern education 신지 변화 요마파 이제 선물로 좀 싫어요 말에. So when we first came into exile, the situation was very difficult. Our people, even though Tibetan language came from India, the spoken language was different. So none of the Tibetans could speak. Very few Tibetans could speak. They became elite Tibetans, those who could speak little Indian languages or few Indian languages. They don't say, northeast India's, there are two places called Boxer and Misamari. So Boxer la, ani kenduba sama shower. Usho sama pene chu pejo, kenduba digeti Boxer se asale de shure. Ani Misamari says la, anga de miman kuma digeti. Lay people were put up in a place called Misamari, and then we were not used to Indian climate. We always lived in the mountains, and India, particularly in the places where we were put up of very hot climatic condition, and we were not used to Indian food diet. Because kalage nga komyo malwa, ani kashegi tanangado maidadwa paleswa dusa zabana shichi seabde ne yor ta tung indu ne mamuyor. Ine dire chine mi mamu chongale, pudre mamu chong. Tushe kane mamu jite ani jele jawa shungi Himalaya ki ta on the foothills of Himalayas where the climatic conditions are a little more suitable to us. So Tibetans were relocated to the foothills of Himalayas. The only thing we knew was hard labor. So your grandparents, my parents, road construction, Jambasia, Manalisia, Simlasia, Northeast there, Omdelasia, there was Langas with Devs, 아니 갈래 아니 the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, wrote to all the state chief ministers because the land belongs to the state, not the federal government. Right? 자가 유슈를 사자다기요 말에 사자다야디 자가 응아대 슈를 다기요. So the first Prime Minister wrote to all the state chief ministers asking them who would be willing to provide land for Tibetan rehabilitation. So the place where I was born, the Balipudi, that was the first big settlement because the Karnataka government, that state is called Karnataka. Those days it used to be known as Mysore state, not Karnataka as it's called today. So they offered 3,000 acres of land for 3,000 Tibetans to move to South India. So that's how slowly we established compact communities of Tibetans in exile. From Pibingi, Rudu, Shijastamne, and Pibingi Dudu Sane, Mana Chen, Balukubesia, Kunsusia, Mongolia, Polygasia, Northeast Layori, North Layori, West Layori, Central Layori, Menpat, Padra, Orissa, Shijamangu, Tsuchita, Nation Chawa. So in the beginning, our people were not educated, but they were very dedicated, and they had a lot of faith in His Holiness. And because of that, our struggle continued, even though they were not educated. So most of the times when we had to protest, first generation, we are saying, so I've never seen Tibet myself. So to fulfill my emotional needs, I go to the border areas in India, from Arunachal Pradesh to Gangtok, Sikkim to Ladakh, where we can see Tibet from this side of India, from on the other side. Now the responsibility lies with our generation. I am 56, 57 years old. I don't know my real birthday. Because my parents had 9 kids and there were no good documentation those days. So I only know that I was born on a Saturday because my name is Penpa. Many people named after days like Sunday, Monday, Ima Dawa, Ima Hagwapu, so on, Pyungudwa, Ushini, Lamatu, Jansul, Chena, Yuna, and Yam, Shabayo. Timadu, Madu, Pamanzu, Ming, Teguzu, Penpa Tsering, that they should go. Sabebari Kevare, considering what they were sure some year. So whether I live long or not, it's a different matter. Those years, this is that another generation, Mount Church, Dharamsala, headquarters was sold. And the last year, Mount Church, Maletis, Kembata, Maletis, Shuma, a permanent Sundangi generation, mirror ticket, those is some of the retired chief, France Kale Gap, Zul Kale Gap. That next generation did can't show you that. I'm not looking what child will read, not to shoot will read, and not to get what child did some other can't we game a killer. If you don't take up the responsibility, there will be nobody else to take the responsibility in future. But here is some gang here would raise that when we talk about responsibility, then you have to know what you are supposed to do. 수술되게 가르치고 있는데 마시나 아니 개인기에 하는 우마와 뒤에 선발라 아니 개 칸슬라 여기 basic information distribution. Whenever we travel out 야가만 땅도 lot to do there sometimes we assume too much or we live under the illusion that people know about us. But when I travel around, even after 63 years in exile, 파수 루드 선배 야가나 오늘 대백골라 내주 차상 보시는 빼면서 공부를 담블링 신발 대회장 대백골 신발 와시라 아니 캬즈 랍다도 산도 나올라 아니 근도 가네 바스타니 깨지 티베트랜드 선배 티베트골 하고 빼니 유로와 이 선배 딱 여름시 만줄 leader we have a leader that no others have in the form of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama traveled around the world in the last 60 plus years. Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. Even now His Holiness tells us Then when His Holiness started traveling around the world for the first time around 1967, when His Holiness visited Japan, Thailand, Chilia, Hamatango, Chibina. Then, 1973, His Holiness visited Europe for the first time. And in the United States, His Holiness came for the first time in 1979. Compassion, love, forgiveness, non-violence. His Holiness started teaching Buddhist philosophy based on non-violence, compassion, and all that. What did they say? And means of tonale, message of peace, and tonale, and if the big did you collect to sing, political awareness, those lectures. That because of His Holiness' effort, the issue of Tibet still remains in this world. Otherwise, we are only 130,000 Tibetans now. And I said earlier, when we first came, it was only about 85,000 Tibetans. And at that time, India today is 1.4 billion people. But there may be only 350, 400 million people. And if you spread these 80,000 Tibetans all over India, now we are facing new challenges. That younger generations of Tibetans are moving out. They do some other, manga children do some other, Shija Namola, and Shunge Meache, Shunge Mena, Puting Marwa. Umajena, and a Lapta Kangachigwa, school system Kangachigwa. So even though we are getting dispersed, and Tanda Dale in Minnesota, Dawachinata, Pavani Donson Don Sura, Pavani Donson Don Su, Rucheche, and Lapta to Saju Lapta to Shin to, and Council of Pui, Laveta, Pugay. You should be proud of being a Tibetan. Identity if you don't understand about Tibet, then you won't feel proud of being a Tibetan. So at one time, some 15 years ago, I met a Pakistani journalist, and he asked me, which is bigger, Bhutan or Tibet? So even journalists don't have that idea about which is bigger, because Bhutan is a very small place. Presentation, maybe I'll start by letting you know the global significance of Tibet. Why Tibet is important not only for Tibetans, but for the whole world, as to why it is important. So, to recite that prayer for the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So when we say Khangri Rave Korve Shingham Di Puyinalola, the second slide na Devaina, and then Khangri Rave Korve Shingham Diris Kadisabala, the Khonju Dushigure in the heavenly abode encircled by snow mountain ranges. Or you can call it heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Now, why do we call ourselves the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges? So what are the ranges that encircles Tibet on the Tibetan plateau? Any subject and the next wall. This is a satellite image. This is not a painting. This is in the south, you have the whole Himalayan range, which is the highest mountain ranges in the world. And then on the west, you have the Karakoram range. In the north, you have the Kunlun range. And in the east, there are a series of mountain ranges. So why we call ourselves the land encircled by snow mountain ranges. There's some other, and then Hogandilia, Homona, Himalaya, and Changwana, Karakor, Nugmona, Karakor, and then Changwana, Honduria, Shalomona, Mongoyo, the Shaka Tuina, Nazu, Rangi, Kanri, Rave, Kobe, Shinham Jong, again, Dilla, Hanchin in the Buemeti, Mishama, the Shaka Tudwa, the Jigche. That name, Westerners, Tibet remained isolated for many centuries. Of course, we had our fights with our neighboring countries like China, Mongolia, Iran. Not so much fight with India because you have to climb over so many mountains and down so many valleys to get into India. There's so much that, but we had our fight with Nepal and Bhutan. They didn't have them Western countries, European, Americans came very late into Tibet. Europeans, they started coming into Tibet only by late 16th century. Late 16th century, Chile, Christian missionaries, because they considered Tibet as the last frontier where Christianity could not penetrate. And then, issue 배가 있고 나와라. 모두신 한국 용어들 제스웨스들이 제스웨스들이 막 붙임스들이 용어들이 내체는 리베르베 고도 별 용어들이 I read a book called the Frontier Post by an American, and one of the chapters is titled as the Roof of the World. So now today Westerners call Tibet, the travelers to Tibet call Tibet as the roof of the world. That big togang why? The question why it is the roof of the world? Then again, if you look from the south of India, the satellite image shows that Tibet is jutting out of that geographical area. The roof of the world, the average altitude of Tibet is about 12,000 feet. Average altitude, about 12,000 feet above sea level. And that's equivalent to about 3,700 to 800 meters. Meters, feet, metric, So when I was in Japan, I was speaking to a group of students in schools. I asked them, which is the highest mountain in Japan? Any idea? Japan is Ritoshu Kare. Everest, Fuji. And then I asked them, okay, Mount Fuji, Ritoshu was. What is the altitude? They said 3,700, 800 meters. Then I said, that's like base camp in Tibet. So you start climbing from that altitude, from that height. So that is how high Tibet is. That is why they call Tibet as the roof of the world. 그 토간디 자문이기 아니 가소리다. 아주 강배이나 강배 토하는 신시. 그러나 어디는 신데 신이 제시ገብ이 선발도 제시 도시죠. Now today 딩사 갸나기 쿠유 세리바 Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet as the third pole. Now which are the other poles?
North and south.
North and south. So North Pole and South Pole, and Tibet is called as the third pole. Now why it is called the third pole? Because this shows that aside from North Pole and South Pole, Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds most of the rivers that originate from Tibet. 벽이 통하니까 아니 손에다 장내는 장내는 North Pole, 손에는 South Pole. 아니 벽내 숨어 애들 도신 차니 디가 벽 통하니까 차고 마슈 North Pole, the South Pole 마 벽이 벽가 차고 마슈 차기 위해서 this that show. That now what Asians now call Tibet as the water tower of Asia. Now water tower of Asia 가신이라고 해야 되나? These are the So in the west, rivers that originate from Tibet like Sutlej and Indus. This is Indus and the other one is Sutlej. It originates from Tibet, goes into India, and it goes into Pakistan. Now the Indus River is the cradle of Indus Valley civilization, which is one of the oldest civilizations. Again, any parents civilization, parents, Indus Valley Indus Valley gidi 용약 추용사디 연애용도와 얘네 신신이 배유 나눠라 충만들이 누구였다 배유랑 뭔가 준주와 얘네 사마라 배유 나눠라 까나리래 누구였대 and 다른 신신이 되는 막 Ganges that originates from border of India and Tibet. Ganges originates from there. That the 강들라 다 하사치로 얘기들 짱고도와 this is the Zangbo, which is called Brahmaputra in English. This originates from Western Tibet, goes into Eastern Tibet, and then it takes a U-turn. Okay, U-turn to go into south. South, this the great bend. The great bend where the Brahmaputra takes a U-turn and comes into India. And then flows into Bangladesh. Which is Samala. So Zambodian, Numanina Ludwa, Kasure, Yahatang, Bangladesh Ludwa. That the name Pajor River, Pajona, and it's serving that Irrawaddy land, Guzuchaladi, Barmana to here. Then you have one of the major rivers called Mekong. Mekong Ponywa. Mekong River originates from Tibet and then it flows into Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. 5 countries in Southeast Asia. Pakistan, Nepal, India, Bangladesh. 4 countries in South Asia. Then Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. 5 countries in Southeast Asia. And then the 2 rivers that flows into China. Gangdela, Yellow River. Yellow River is the cradle of Chinese civilization. Again, one of the oldest civilizations in this world. So, Yellow River and the Yangtze River. So these 2 are the lifelines of China. It's only because of these 2 rivers that China can support a population like 1.4 billion people. If it is not for these 2 rivers, they cannot be civilizations. And they will not be able to support that many number of people. So from this, you can see why Asians call Tibet as the water tower of Asia. The Great Bend clashing, Great Bend, they are building a dam twice the size of Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world. Zamuling Nala, Chunju Dam, Chunju Shishu di Tada Gyana Nala, Three Gorges Dam. And this whole Himalayan region is jutted out like this. Because this is because of the tectonic shift between the Gondwana plate and the Eurasian plate. Even now, scientists say that Himalaya is growing by 10 millimeter every year because the tectonic shifts are still happening and Himalaya is still growing out of that. When they are building such a huge dam, how much land is going to be inundated upstream? So that destroys a lot of flora and fauna, which are very unique to the Tibetan Plateau in that region. Zixingdang, flora dan, Zixingche, fauna di Semje. Semje naso yorba. This is a flora, the fauna, togan dina the meyo, flora, fauna, now, this whole place is seismic zone. Because just last month I was in Brazil, and at that time there was an earthquake in Herat in Afghanistan, because the Himalaya starts from there. I think Payula earthquake, Jale earthquake, these are all, because the tectonic shift is still happening, so it's very prone to earthquakes. Now, if something happens to that size of a dam, because of seismic movements, right, then what will happen to people downstream in Arunachal Pradesh, in Assam, and in Bangladesh? They are all going to be washed away. It's going to be very catastrophic. Right? So unfortunately, China does not share hydrological data with any of its neighboring countries. Yanagi, Chu Mango, Nyuma, Kazu, Yumedi, Nunga Shimba, Nunga Shimba, Chu Ruyo, Nuzula, Kunjugi, Laguyo Mare. So China uses Tibet's water like a water tap. Now, Togala, Kaduni, Chutegi, you have water tank on top of your apartment or building, whatever. Then you sambala, Chu Mango, they let it go. Chuna and wall flooding your world. Right? And Chunyungu is some Kashagir. Dam is looking. Dam, multiple dams that they have near Kashagir. Then you have drought in the downstream areas. Right? Chume and Chukam di Sambala and Pendoike Matuju. So many people's lives are being impacted in the downstream countries, downstream riparian states, as they say. So, Digi Karitungurusana. 여기 구류 개척 해가지고 난 이외에 갔어요. 다 당국이 나도 배우기 세부 유교들 나도 배우러 와. Now how Bhutan the 배우니 들은 다 가요. Nepal the 배우들다. How many times Nepal is Tibet, right? Now if you compare that with United Kingdom, UK, it's 10 times the size of UK, Tibet. It's 18 times the size of Japan. Japan 좁게 교육청이에요. So that's how big Tibet is in terms of landmass. And in terms of area, it's about 2.5 million square kilometers. And China's total area, including Tibet, is about 9.7 million square kilometers. So 2.5 out of 9, let's round it up to 10. So 2.5 out of 10 is what percentage? Very simple mathematics. About 25% of China's landmass. Okay, it's that big. So historically, politically, we had remained a buffer between the two most populous nations in the world, China and India. Today, China is about 1.4 billion. And India is little more than 1.4 billion. So India has overtaken China's population in terms of size. So today in this world, India is the most populated nation in this world. And China is number 2. Few months back, China used to be number 1. And India was number 2. So politically, we had always been a political buffer between the two most populous nations in the world. And there has never ever been a war between China and India. Only after communist China invaded Tibet, and then Tibet became part of China, there was the first war between India and China in 1962. Right? 지금 이제 중국인이로라, 자나다, 야가파라, 강구쇼, 셰바, 여기 그런 거네. 혼자 산점이 이거만. They don't have a common boundary. So there was never ever a war between China. And this level, people will understand. Then you talk about history of Tibet as to whether Tibet was independent or not before China's occupation or communist occupation of China. Just to give you a very brief overview, Tibet was a huge empire between 7th to 9th century. In 8th century, we even invaded the capital of China. Today, capital of China is Beijing. So those days, it was not Beijing. It was Xi'an. Okay, Xi'an. So we captured Xi'an, and the Tibetan emperor put a puppet Chinese emperor in that place. So the Tibetan Empire extended from Xi'an to present-day Samarkand in Uzbekistan. So that used to be the extent of Tibetan Empire at one time. So, 뒤집라 먼저 베베게 나시나 쳔부이 게르qabla. 쳔부 그 쳔부 최계 손대가 뭐 아니 최계 치손 되었지. 아니 가다 지리 된주기 뒤줄라 아니 왜 살이 까친 거 쉬우지. 아니 왕초보시오지 차대가. Then Tibet disintegrated for about 400 years between 9th century to 13th century. So we divided ourselves into many principalities. There was not a single ruler for the whole of Tibet for about 400 years. But within those periods, even though politically we were not strong, religiously we had a lot of achievements. Right? So again, going back to 7th century, during King Sonzai Gampo's time, we invented the Tibetan script that we use today. It was invented in 7th century. And that was derived from Indian script, Gupta and Brahmi script. It is Tibetan language, Tibetan script has nothing to do with Chinese language. 단다 표현이 있잖아. 추디 좀 베베게 나 개미게 저와하리요래. 베베게디 개미게니 연결 왜 이렇게 시키고 와. 근데 추디 베이직 인포메이션도 이 베베게디 야간에 채식을 만들지 개미게다 저와서니 이거 말. 아니 베베게 낭슈지와 봐. Tibetan Buddhism that also came directly from India. Even though Buddhism spread to China much before it came to Tibet. 야간 낭슈디 야간에 파 야나라 3rd century 되번에 다리요. 먼저 그 낭슈 말랭이 로 쉽게 숨어네 야나라 파 다리요. 이내 야나기 화샹나니 야미기 부디스트도 그래요. And Tibetan emperor had a debate between the Chinese Buddhists and the Tibetan Buddhists, 가자 Indian Buddhists. 아니 가말라시라 다 야미 화샹도 저거다치 아니 야미 그 야기 가말라시라 지금 톱니 아니 최게 지송기 가자 아마도 야기 딱 angshudi 야네 지금 인스타 we will practice Buddhism that originated from India. So even today His Holiness keeps saying Tibetan Buddhism is based on or founded on the Nalanda tradition. So one of the peculiarity or uniqueness of Tibetan Buddhism is also, it is not a blasphemy if you say anything against the Buddha. 주로 쉐바드네이나 프랑스 우토바 지어와 주 당구뱅이치 딜리야 간중군줄랍다 미망 야다라도와 blasphemy라는 경 간주 군조다 간주 우토바야 도리 메제라고 줬어요. 상계 좀 된데 주 숭시교가 수수 르고 땅네 상계 좀 된데 숭시교 뒤에 경전 때문에 마레시아 사바이는 좀 다추리. If you think Buddha's teaching is not reasonable, but you should be that much knowledgeable to disprove Buddha's teaching, right? 야면 수술을 보시고 저 대표백이 숭시교 뒤에 경전 만되면 이거는 상황 룩투 오르면 just because you think it is not that right, 뒤집고 뒤고 왔다. 경전 거를 맞으시. You have to have reason. That is why Tibetan Buddhism is very dynamic. Buddhism is very dynamic. It can adapt according to changing times, right? And it's more scientific than any other religion. It can go with science, and with a religious leader like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His Holiness always says that if science has proven something, then I'm not going to argue against it. But science is more for physical science, right? But Tibetan Buddhism has more to do with mental science. So that is why Tibetan Buddhism is by itself is very adaptable to change. And so that is what you are doing. That that geopolitical significance is now Tibet was an independent state. Disintegration, but during those periods, Tibetan masters went to India and learned Buddhism before Buddhism vanished from India because of Muslim invasion. But before Buddhism vanished from India, Tibetans transcribed or transliterated every available Sanskrit text into Tibetan language. Sanskrit la manju vivekena kalagre lecture di ke 당에 누가 지고 있다면 그 상황 고쳐야 됩니다. 그래서 lecture di ke na 강 요바디 상황도 그게 나는 유리해요. So Tibetan language is the only language where we have all the teachings of the Buddha in its pristine form. That is why when I go around the world, we tell the world that we are very proud to be a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom that is manifested in the form of messages of His Holiness to the world. Now we are seeing the other thing, and then Mongols became a huge empire in Central Asia. Genghis Khan 번영화, Genghis Khan 다 아니 거기 가서 비교하다 우도 Khan 되는 말이오니 Kublai Khan was the fifth Khan. So Kublai Khan 다 표현이 여차더라. At that time Tibet was disintegrated. So Kublai Khan became the protector, and the Tibetan Lama Sakyapeti the Kumajanje became the priest or teacher to the Mongols, because the Mongols were ruthless. If they want to invade Minneapolis, they first go to Chicago, they kill everybody in Chicago. By the time they reach Minneapolis, people just surrender because it's not worth fighting and getting killed. We were good to the Chinese. Later, mid-13th century. And then later, Kublai Khan invaded China. And for Chinese history, it became the Yuan dynasty from 1271 to 1368. So for Chinese, it's Yuan dynasty, but the Mongols were there even before that and even after that. What should we do? Or is it too deep? What should we do? So the Mongols were overthrown by the Ming dynasty. Mings are real Han Chinese. They ruled China from 1368 to 1644. So within those 300 plus years, Tibet was ruled by the Sakyappas for 100 years. That was followed by the Pamadruva dynasty in Tibet for about 100 years. That was followed by another 100 years of Rinpoche dynasty. Then another 100 years of Devatsangpa dynasty. So we had 3-4 dynasties. When the Mongols were there, it was the Sakyappas. Then following the Mongols, when China was ruled by the Mings, we had Pamadruva dynasty, Rinpoche dynasty, and Devatsangpa dynasty. Till the 5th Dalai Lama became the spiritual and temporal leader of Tibet in 1642, in 17th century. So Dalai Lama, 14th Dalai Lama. Then since then, from 1642 to now, Tibet has been ruled or being ruled by the successive Dalai Lamas, from the 5th to the 14th Dalai Lama. So the Mings were overthrown by the Qings. So the Qings are not real Chinese, they are Manchus. They come from a place called Manchuria, north of Beijing. They ruled China from 1644 to 1911. So can you find the difference of 2 years? 1642, the 5th Dalai Lama had already become the ruler of Tibet, but China was under Ming. Right? 2 years after that, China was ruled by the Qings, 1644. So these are very intricate nuances, but very important historically to prove that Tibet was independent and Tibet was not part of China those years. So Tibet was part of China since time immemorial. When is time immemorial? 500, 1000, 2000, 3000, 5000 years. So sometimes they say, oh, Tibet was part of China since time antiquity. And the world does not study Tibetan history. And they keep parroting what Chinese government wants them to say. In some way, it's very important to read Tibetan history. So I would recommend that you read a book called Tibet Brief 2020, which is one of the latest books that came out in the last 3 years. From Michael Van Wall, Juan Prax, and Tibet Brief 2020. in which he had not studied just the history of Tibet from a Tibetan perspective, but he had discourses with some 70, 80 scholars from all the countries surrounding Tibet over a period of 7 to 8 years, and he came out with this book. And he establishes the fact that whether it was Tibet-Mongol relationship, or Tibet-Ming relationship, or Tibet-Qing relationship, or as per international law today, Tibet has never been considered a part of China. 다 shuman choba jawana temi bu jam choba jawana ni kemi mi shuman so phel di ganang chashi resen la de yuna madu pha deshe gap tu wa deshe gap tu na an nu ma de ta ane ba tang tu na pha ke deshe ga yo wa mo do she an di shin wa de pemes ke shum re she da in historical perspective the overview and if you read more books there is the Tibetan Shaba's history of Tibet written by a Tibetan. Even a Tibetan in Vancouver, BC, Sikyong Penpa, a modern scholar, had written a history on Tibet, and Tissue Westerners have written history of Tibet. So you read many different books, how China tries to portray Tibet's history, how the Western scholars understand Tibetan history, and what a Tibetan perspective of Tibetan history, and then you will be able to reach a judgment as to what Tibetan history is. Now, of course, Tibet was independent, but His Holiness is following what we call as the middle way policy. So, Ume Lam is a Buddhist concept. So, the middle way, the concept is there because what that means is to avoid extreme polarities, extremities. avoid shokuya. Umas is about langa hidwa. Tiny sumanuan, together tiny tal is about extreme positions. So avoid extreme positions but follow a middle way. And now this is becoming more and more a political statement and political solution for many of the problems. Some people call it the third way. The third way, middle way, but third way does not necessarily mean middle way. Okay? So the political sense now, but that was first used by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to seek a political solution based on Buddhist concept. What are the polarities? The polarity, one polarity is the situation or the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. The other polarity is the present situation of Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. These are the extreme polarities. So we are trying to find a middle way where the Tibetans will have a freedom or have the freedom to practice its language, to use its language, and practice its religion, promote its way of life, because your way of life is dictated by the philosophy that you follow, which is based on Buddhism. Right? traditional way environment that is what is middle way all about. Now, if you go into details, there will be a lot more details. So today we will not go into this, but when you study a little more, then you can understand. Then we are talking about many competencies, powers, sharing of powers. So and when you talk about government, there are so many competencies at many levels. So, in historical perspective, and political significance. Political significance, the middle way. Now, if we are able to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict through the middle way policy, then this will bring about more trust between the two most populous nations in this world. So this has global significance. And Tibetan approach to resolving problems is non-violence. Non-violent, and now you every day you hear about Israel, Hamas. Do you watch news at all? And universities, these are all violence. The Tibetan way is the true middle way. We follow non-violence. And unfortunately, in this world, there is not much focus on non-violent movements. That is what we keep telling the international community, that we need more focus on non-violent movements. Everywhere where you have war, any media someone who so I tell them, this is more like you are promoting violence because you give so much footage to violent conflicts. And if you give focus on non-violent means of resolving conflicts, then appreciate people will start appreciating non-violence as a movement. So there have been leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, even in the United States during the Civil War, following the Civil War, Mirina Pola, Martin Luther King, South Africa, apartheid regime, Nelson Mandela, there are very few cases of non-violent movements. And His Holiness is a leading light for non-violence. And Buddhist culture, how important Tibetan Buddhist culture is for this world. Global significance. So political significance of Tibet, environmental significance of Tibet globally, and the importance of Tibetan Buddhist culture, which is based on non-violence. That is how Tibet is related to this world. You will also feel proud of being a Tibetan. Because you go to the So WeTech is a platform that we created, the 16th cabinet. My cabinet is the 16th cabinet now, right? From 1959, 60 onwards, when we democratized, is our 16th cabinet. WeTech member chini, when you join Tibetan advocacy groups, when you reach out to other people, then you have to explain what is going on inside Tibet. Right? Now people say, and Tibet, the Sino-Tibet conflict has been a very prominent cause in this world. Many people know about Tibet, but not so much in detail. And the situation inside Tibet keeps changing. So at present in Tibet, first thing, there is no political space whatsoever. What we take for granted, they protest karina 제초도와 삼로 땅에 라왕 톤의 땅 토도와 땅 초도와 계제시에 있는 라왕 톤의 시 초도와 내가 지역에 있는 라왕 톤의 수준 너가 시중 지혜도와 this does not exist in Tibet. If you carry a picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you get arrested. Right? If you say free Tibet, there is no political space. Have any of you heard about George Orwell's 1984? George Orwell, he taped 1984 says. It talks about how state or government surveils and controls people. This is exactly what's happening in China today, where the government controls everything. So have you heard that 157 Tibetans self-immolated from 2009 till about last year? Self-immolate themselves. 157 Tibetans have self-immolated from 2009 till about last year, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or hoping against hope that the international community will come to their rescue. China does not give access to foreigners to visit Tibet. So there is no witness, there is no evidence, and the world looks for evidence. And China knows that without evidence, the world will not be able to support the Tibetans. There was a time way back in 1963 when a Vietnamese monk burned himself to death and it became international news. In 1968, a Czech Republic person burned himself to death and it became international. Now in today's Tibet, 157 Tibetans burned themselves, but it's still not a news. It's very pathetic. And most of these self-immolators were between the age of 17 to 35. They have never witnessed independent Tibet. They have never witnessed what is called the 10 years of cultural revolution in the whole of China and also in Tibet. So cultural revolution happened, they destroyed everything old. And these people have not witnessed all this. They only see what Chinese government is doing to Tibet and Tibetans today. And they feel desperate. So because of this desperation, and they burn themselves to death, calling for attention on their plight. Today, electronic identification, geolocation. Chinese government is collecting DNA samples of Tibetans. DNA Today, if I commit a political act which China considers as criminal, then through my DNA, if I am the perpetrator, they will find out through DNA who is related to me. So, another target they become suspicious. And they also get arrested. Now, if you are coming from outside Lhasa, if I'm living in Lhasa, we are friends. Either you come to Lhasa and live in a hotel. If you live in a hotel, you show your identification and they can track you. Now, if you live with me and my family as a friend, and if you commit a political act, then I will be responsible also. So that is the kind of gridlock they have introduced. So it's impossible to do anything. Today, if I think about burning myself, I may get scarred for life or I might die. But then I have to think about my immediate family and friends. Iris scan without consent. All these modern technology are being used to surveil people and to control people. That is why China is the only country that spends more money on internal security than external security. So politically they check. Now religiously, when Tibet was independent, we had these huge big monasteries like Sera, Kanden, Drepung in the Gelug tradition, and there are also many big monasteries in other traditions, Nyingma, Sadhya, Kagyu, Gambo, Chunang, the Dewa Goma Chimu Gomuyuare. 7,700, 5,500, 3,300 monks in one monastery in Tibet. Today, it has come down to just 300, 400, 500. 그 용조 나눠라. 그래서 타워 티시스만 지금도 와. 나도 전주 지고 나눠라 타워 티시스요. Not all Tibet. Okay. 어두시니 나 타워 장가만 공식. Now, if monks and nuns have to move from one place to another, they need at least 4 or 5 different permits to move, just to move from one place to another. And Chinese government is communist government. They don't believe in religion. Mao Zedong told His Holiness the Dalai Lama way back in 1954 that religion is poison. But they are setting up religious curriculum in the monasteries. I think CCTV cameras in all the monasteries, because monasteries are considered sensitive areas where political actions are more prominent or more frequent. These are CCTV guards, they watch every movement. Now the management earlier used to be handled by Tibetan monks and nuns. Now it has been taken over by state security agencies or United Front Work Department. This is multiple agencies to control. So the management of monasteries are now taken over. Monasteries are not managed by the Tibetans. And the last nail on the coffin is the Chinese government wants to be responsible to recognize reincarnated lamas. Chinese government that does not believe in religion wants to be responsible for recognizing reincarnated lamas. 맞아 추구단데 영어도와 추군도 문지치에데 게나 슝기 저거요 나왔다. 아니 게나 슝 추를 캐랭게요 말봐. So His Holiness in jest says if Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first. Because reincarnation is very unique to Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism. There are many Buddhist countries in this world, but they don't have that system. It's only with the Tibetan Buddhist system. If Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first. Then they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation, because he is already dead. Then Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation. Now even Jiang Zemin is dead, the third president of China, General Secretary of Communist Party. He is also dead. Then maybe the Dalai Lama His Holiness always says it, yes. And when you listen to these answers, then you understand His Holiness' wisdom. How he retorts Chinese statements. This is how religious freedom or freedom of religious belief does not exist in Tibet. Even if it exists, it's only for the facade. There is no real teaching of the Buddha's messages. Language. I already told you that we transliterated every available Sanskrit text into Tibetan in 8th century onwards, up to 13th century, right? So that is why Tibetan language is one language that has preserved the pristine teachings of Buddha that is not available in any other language, in its entirety. So just before coming here, I met a linguist who says Tibetan language is one of the 15 oldest languages in this world. Tibetan script is one of the 15 oldest scripts in this world. There are 76 language families in Tibet. There are 305 different ways of dialect. So that's how important Tibetan language is to the world, not only for the Tibetans. So he also told me there are 3 languages, one in Amazonia, one in Papua New Guinea, and Tibet. When you use the language, you have to apply your mind. And it's not the same with any other languages. That's how important Tibetan language is. And now Chinese government is striking at the very root of our identity, language. So when China is doing in the form of colonial style boarding schools. So when you point that out to the Chinese, how did Americans treat its own natives? Or how did Canadians treat their First Nation people? Or how did Australians treat their Aboriginals and the Torres Strait Islanders? Or how the New Zealanders treated the Maori people, who are the native people, right? Or even with the Scandinavians, they talk about how the Scandinavians treated the Sami people. Sami, they are located in the north of Scandinavia with Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Russia. 뭔가 시스기 정모자 Sami 미릭도요. 야 동바티스 간도 저기로 본사와 Arctic Circle 등소라 망부지 간도 동바 나오도와 에스키모사도. So what that means is China knows what these countries did was wrong. 이마 아메리카 네티브 가르치고 노르웨이가 먼저 하고요. Canadian First Nation 가르치고 노르웨이가 하고 knowingly they are doing it to the Tibetans today to destroy our identity. So now Tibetan children are put up in boarding schools, away from their family, away from their culture, away from their religion, and Tibetan language is now being done away with in the school system. 아니 슈마 벽에 나오는 벽에 되려면 다 슈마 벽에 수이되거든. 수이되거든. 한 안주 잡고. 한 안주 벽에 말려는 다 벽에 라고 정말이 되나오라. 봐. 벽에 짜 친구 이거디 안주 배주마다나 아니 그 dead language 하고 봐. 대신에 캐나다로 가도 이제 벽이 장로시 벽에 장로시 벽이 장로시 쓰는 다와 라딩도 와. It's not because we don't 가지고 완전 지금 안으로 force 이게 말해. Because of what is happening inside Tibet, and we live in the free world. There's nobody telling you don't study Tibetan or you can't study Tibetan, right? And Tibetans inside Tibetan kids don't have the freedom. We are not against education of the Tibetan children. We are not even against bilingualism, but we are against an educational system that is aimed at changing all the younger Tibetans into Chinese. The whole mindset. 중화 배워보고 넣어서면 배워보고 벽에 야마싱에 배워보고 벽에 로유 마싱에 배워보고 벽에 공시 마싱에 배워보고 벽에 낭시오 마싱에 그래서는 아는 배워다 재미 찍고 잘 올라다. That is what is called a sinicization of Tibetans. That is what is called a sinification of Tibetans, turning every young Tibetan children into a Chinese. Now, if this goes on for another few decades, it's going to be very, very detrimental for us. These are some of the examples of what is happening in Tibet right now. So when we traveled, I traveled, Minister for Department of Information, International Relations, and the whole department travels around the world to tell the international community this is what is happening inside Tibet, so we need help. And some of these issues like colonial style boarding schools resonates very well with Americans, resonates very well with Canadians because they themselves experienced, they themselves did this to their own people. So Canadian politicians are like, this is what happened in Canada, so we don't want this to happen in any other parts of the world. We feel that this is the best solution right now. If you ask for independence, China will not listen to you. And there is not a single country in this world who supports independence of Tibet. Right? So what we are trying to work out now, we follow the middle way policy, but we changed our tactic or the ways to do it, to achieve middle way. So we focus a little bit on the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. There should be some recognition of Tibet as an independent state historically. And that is what we have been doing. Last year, we had the first hearing on the historical status of Tibet in the US Congress. 아메리카 조선은 올라 예십 hearing나 예십 테마 당구직 먼저 10월에 그디 루주기 돈에 랑생 레라디 당행에 Tibet Brief 2020 author Michael Van Praag for Sheswan Tibet Brief 2020. 그래서 나도 화살와 그거 터지 얘기한 말이에요. 아니 쇼마야 빠라를 계시래. 가나 시경 갈라서 대 가리밍 나서네. You should look for these books and read these books. Tibet Brief 2020. And then there is a Chinese professor called Professor Lau who wrote another book where he argues that Tibet has never been considered a part of China based on Chinese imperial historical records. Yanagi Kransogi emperors Tibet Cheshiogi Luyu Nalola Pödi Yanagi Chahitani Jinyu Mendustani. All the sugar. That is a share amount of the attention there, Kale, Wayne, Chirudra, in Sambala. And that case should be how do you engage yourself? First, inform yourself. Read more. Understand more about what I talked about just now in more detail. Have this month's look, this month, yeah. And it's showing up, there's a single bar. Tibet Advocacy Group planning, we have created a platform. Now Tibetans are scattered in more than 25 different countries, including the United States. Okay? Now you have become citizens here. And eventually when you become 18, you will have the right to vote, those who are not yet 18, to elect your own representatives or senators. And then you have the right to ask your senators, ask your representatives to do this for Tibet, do that for Tibet. You have the right, it's not a privilege, it's your right to ask them to do what you want them to do. If you join this WeTag, Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group, it's meant for every Tibetan to join this group. It's a common platform, whether you are advocating independence, you are advocating middle way, it doesn't matter. We don't need to be fighting against each other within our community. Right? You focus all your energy against China. Why do you fight amongst ourselves? 아니 위탁나 조인처에나 아니 제가 아니 지금 배배꼴 대신 가리가 버려. 가리가는 내가 지르시라고. From time to time, these ask. 아주 니치로치라 해줘라. It changes because things changes inside Tibet, and our priorities also change. Based on those priorities, you will keep abreast of situations. But first.
Maintain and preserve like Minnesota community law. On the little onto big communities we maintaining onto how can we do it as a younger generation?
Okay. Minnesota 랑.
Yeah.
Now see every time. When we started first, I talked about the generational shift, right? So now, the first generation who came from Tibet, they did their best. Now most of them are retired, or they are no more in this world. Now it is our generation that is being responsible, and the younger ones. So next time, it will be your generation, right? So wherever there is a sizable number of Tibetans, we have these Tibetan associations. Minnesota, so Tibetan American Foundation of Minnesota. So there is a body that functions under the whole of North America. The United States and Canada comes under the Office of Tibet, Washington, D.C. So in Washington, D.C., we have our main office. So now we are scattered in more than 25 different countries, and we have our de facto embassies de facto. Quasi ambassadors. So we have an office in Japan for East Asia. We have one office in Taiwan, in Taipei, only for Taiwan. And we have one office in Canberra for Australia, New Zealand, and some parts of Southeast Asia. And we have one office in Delhi, from Thailand to Middle East, but we are not able to reach out to so many countries. Then we have one office in Nepal, in Kathmandu for Nepal. We have one office in Moscow for Central Asia, but now our representative is sanctioned by Putin because he's mentioned something about the Ukraine war. And we have one office in London for the whole of North Europe, from Iceland to UK to Scandinavia, the Baltics. So next month or January, I'm going to the Baltics, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland, right? Yes, and then we have one office in Brussels for countries from Portugal to Spain to France to Benelux. There's Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, these areas. Then we have one office, smaller office in Paris, and we have one office in Geneva for whole of Southern Europe, some 22 different countries, 23 different countries. And we have one office in Pretoria in South Africa for the whole of Africa, but we are not able to go beyond South Africa. And we have one office in Sao Paulo in Latin America for the whole of Latin America. So how we function is we have the Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamsala, and you should feel proud, and I proudly tell the world that we are the only exiled government with a fully functional democratic polity. So even though we are refugees, we are in exile, we have our own government in India. Now we call ourselves Central Tibetan Administration, but others call us Tibetan Government in Exile, right? So we have our parliament, we have our cabinet, we have our Supreme Justice Commission, which are the three organs of democracy. Then we also have Election Commission. We conduct election all over the world in one day, and people get surprised by that. So I keep telling people, if you want to stand for my position, and if you have the time and the resources, then you have to campaign in more than 25 different countries. That's the extent of our electoral system. And then we have our Public Service Commission. We also have our Auditor General's Office, and we are very proud to tell our donors that we have zero corruption in the Tibetan system. So in the United States, in North America, so all the Tibetan associations like Minnesota, I think we have more than 20 different associations in the whole of the United States alone. Because when 1,000 Tibetans were moved here, they were like Darala is here. He's the young man of Minnesota, and he was one of the few Tibetans, or the only Tibetan in Minnesota at that time. And he took the responsibility to bring your parents here to Minnesota by looking for jobs, because that was one criteria. Because if there is job, then we could move people here, right? So Minnesota was one of the places where they could bring more of these 1,000 Tibetans. That is why you have a larger population here, and people still move here. Some others are still moving from New York and other places to Minnesota, so it will keep increasing. And that is how the immigration program took place. And so all these Tibetan associations function on their own with the elected leadership. So today you have broader perspective, Malana, if you don't understand the structure, then you won't know how to contribute, right? So that is how we are organized ourselves. So you have the Office of Tibet, then you have the Tibetan community with the elected leadership. So I have always been encouraging, since we have the older generation and the middle and the younger generation, now people are changing, So I have always been saying we need more younger people to take responsibility for the Tibetan associations. Now these days, because of the generational shift, now you find more and more younger people. She was the former president, and now Pungala is the present president. They will also serve for a few years. They get re-elected again and again. Now it will be up to you. So when they are handling also, we keep telling them, like annually we have Tibetan Losar, where everybody celebrates together. Then we have the 10th March, which is more political action day, commemorating the Tibetan uprising day of 1959 when Tibetans revolted against the Chinese. And then we have His Holiness birthday on 6th July. Then we have 2nd September as Democracy Day. Then we have 10th December as His Holiness receiving the Nobel Peace Prize on International Human Rights Day. So these are 5 major events that the Central Tibetan Administration organizes in Dharamsala and everywhere else. So Tibetan Association of Minnesota also organizes, aside from many other things they do, like my visit here, reaching out to the House representatives or senators and this and that. For the younger generation to get experience and get involved in the Tibetan community, if we entrust you, let us say, if Kungula and the present executive says, okay, you take over His Holiness birthday celebration for next year, and you have very innovative ideas. So keeping the basic theme in mind, if we give you the responsibility to organize that, of course supervised and guided by the seniors, then you get empowered and you feel responsible, right? Elder generation rounds on that. When we start from 1959 or before that, and sometimes we fight with each other, and then younger generation get frustrated. They say, oh, the basketball, you have to get used to those kind of responsibilities. In the Chetuvaina, we are involving the youth in leadership roles. So, on the VTAG day, one of the functions for VTAG joint you have to reach out to your representative here, like Ila Oma. You have to reach out to senators. And when we have a bill being moved in the Congress in Washington, D.C., then you understand the bill first, and then you reach out to your member and say, please support this bill in the Congress. And when you become a little older, and then you retire, and then you will be responsible. Then who will take responsibility in future? So from now onwards, if you understand that this is a responsibility, you need to understand. You get to inform yourself. First, start by informing yourself about what's happening. You can go to tibet.net and read what is happening now. You can go to the private the non-governmental websites like payu.com, which is not controlled by Central Tibetan Administration. Then you have Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, Voice of Tibet, mostly in Tibetan, but they also have English versions. Right? That's also one way of, that's a great thing. Guide. So elder students guide the younger generation to seek admissions in best colleges, universities. That's how we build the fabric of our society. Even though we are dispersed physically, we have to be mentally together. One of the things we are trying to work out is a charter school. That's why Dalai is here today, and Aula is also here today. So we will see whether there's a possibility to start a separate Tibetan school for Tibetan children. We'll also look at possibility to start a compact community by ourselves in Minnesota, because you have the right conditions. Now it has almost been 30 years since your parents came to the United States, not the recent ones, but among the 1,000 lot. Now your parents are quite self-sufficient. They may not have to pay mortgages anymore. You own your own house. Right? Today you do something, now we are much better off than before, financially. Right? So then how do we progress from there? Younger generation, and Minnesota, if we are able to start a compact community in Minnesota, this will be the first outside India and Nepal. Then others can look up to Minnesota and say, if Minnesota can do it, why can't we do it in New York? Or why can't we do it in Bay Area? Or why can't we do it in Toronto, where there are a larger number of Tibetans? Even the European, even the Tibetans in Europe can learn from your experience. And if you are able to start a charter school here, this will be the first Tibetan charter school. But then others can also learn from your experience. And charter schools, there are many levels that you can get involved. And right now I feel very encouraged this morning when we went to the Sunday school, Saturday school, weekend school, there were many of you youngsters who were voluntary. That is also part of involving yourself, becoming part of taking responsibility within the community. It starts from there. So you have to move one step at a time and get involved. And the leadership is also, they have to encourage participation of youth. If you create your, if there is, just as I said, and because your ideas will be based on how you get younger generation to involve oneself. Okay.